Guys, I wanted to go over some of the top 5 newbie mistakes that people make using Photoshop, okay? So I'm going to switch over into my computer so you can see some of those. This is my experience from teaching Photoshop for the past 3 years with high school students, and they're just those common errors that people are like, what's going on? Why is this happening? Also, if you're somebody who is more of a traditional drawing illustrator and you want to go ahead and start working in Photoshop, these are the 5 things that probably might trip you up. So I'm going to switch over to my desktop computer in Photoshop. Alright guys, hi, I'm in Photoshop CC now, and this is an illustration that I've created digitally. Okay, so let's talk about those 5 tips that a lot of times newbie students will make. So the first one I'm going to say is they'll be like, I can't find the tools that you're using, or my tools are not set up. It looks different. Why is my tool different than your toolbar? So this long strip docked here on the left-hand side is your toolbar. Okay, so if I go over to Photoshop, I go to my menu bar and I go to Edit, go down to the bottom, second one, it's called Toolbar. So a lot of times in the beginning, the first time you launch it, a lot of these tools will be on the right hand side. I have my students hit Restore Default, pushes all the tools over, and then I click Done because I think it's a lot easier. You'll notice if it has a tool that's hidden because there's this little tiny triangle, okay? And then you can actually click and then you can see, oh, these are the hidden tools there. Now they're available to you. Okay, so that's tip number 1, your toolbar. Tip number 2, so I'm going to zoom in because it works better if I zoom into the illustration here. Students will be trying to select something, so they'll use your lasso tool or they will use their magic wand or quick selection tool, and they were working away on a certain section of their project. So then they zoom out, and I'm just hitting Command plus or minus if you're on a Mac, Control plus or minus on a PC. And so what they won't notice is they'll have that area selected. Okay, so just those pixels are selected. So then they're trying to use their brush here. And I got it loaded right here with my foreground color of black. And then they're trying to be like, well, I'm trying to paint over here and nothing's happening. What's going on with this? Why is it not working? So it's because they have that little area selected. So I'm going to zoom in again. And that tiny little area, okay, that's only the area that's selected. So I can then, if I use my brush tool now and see how it's filling in with the black, I'll zoom in even further. So now it actually paints just that area. I'm going to hit Command Z on my Mac, Control Z on a PC. And then what they need to do is hit Command D to deselect, or you can go up to select and just hit the deselect option right here at the top. Okay, so that's tip number 2. Check to see if you've inadvertently selected a few small pixels. I've even had a student one time, they selected 1 pixel, and that is really like, wow, I would never have seen it. So always try that. Okay, so tip number 2, check to see if you have something selected that you didn't mean to. Okay. All right, guys, I wanted to talk about tip number 3, okay, error that happens with Photoshop. Okay, so students will not pay attention to what layer they're on, okay? So there's a tendency of wanting to not name layers. So as they work on more complex illustrations, and if you don't label your layers, so like I have like 3 different layers with grass on it. Yeah, you get your little thumbnail preview, but a lot of times you can't really tell because it's small. You can adjust in the preferences, like the size of these. I prefer it about this way because I like the name showing. So if you're not certain and you start working on the wrong layer, I'm just hiding these layers just so you can see that they're separate pieces that have kind of collaged together. So when you're working, sometimes they'll work on the wrong layer, and what happens is they're like, oh, I totally didn't mean to have that on the layer. So my recommendation, so it's like just an example, I just like, oh, I'm just on this layer, I'm coloring in, but I really didn't want it on that layer. Oops, I wanted it on another layer. Yeah, you can undo for a certain period of time, but sometimes students won't catch on until the next time they've opened the file and they're like, Ah, so labeling your layers will be helpful, but also locking layers down. So I will force myself to lock my layers because then it prevents me from actually drawing on the layer I don't need. And it's really hard. It's one of those things, it's really hard for students to get the habit of. And even as somebody who uses Photoshop a lot more frequently for my own personal work, I really have to be mindful. Like, I probably redid this snake several times because I kept drawing some of the values on my line layer. So yeah, and then that became a headache because then I wanted to use my layer modes and it was affecting everything. So just be aware that that can happen, and sometimes you just have to redo it. So that is tip number 3. Pay attention to what layer you're on. All right, mistake number 4. When students are working in Photoshop, I made this moon shape right here. So it's on a separate layer. I just took a circle and just went ahead and deleted part of the circle by using a layer mask. So technically it's not deleted. It's all there. So layer mask, the way I treat it as is if you're just hiding something. Black hides, white shows. Okay, so it's like you're covering it up. So a lot of times students are on their layer mask and they're like, say I'm just tapping the letter X and I switched white to my foreground color, and they're like, well, you know what, I want to go in and paint some white. Okay, nothing's happening. Why is it not happening? Nothing's happening here. So normally would. So you have to be mindful of when you are on your layers, pay attention to which one of these two. I'm hovering over them so you can see. This is your layer mask, this is your layer. So if I click on the actual layer, it affects what's actually on. So if I paint, I'm going to go ahead and be able to see it. I hit Control Z or Command Z on a Mac, and then I switch to my layer mask. Okay, if you're on here, see, I have it set to white. Okay, and then if I were to do black anyways, there's nothing there. So that happens a lot with students. Pay attention. I mean, something's happening here, but there's nothing there on the actual physical layer, so it's not doing anything. So just be aware. Pay attention to what you're actually selecting in your layers when you're using layer masks. Okay? All right, guys, this is tip or mistake number 5. Resolution. So I'm back to my snake illustration here, and I've actually made this illustration when I go to image and I go to something called image size. It shows you I'm working, let me switch it to inches. Okay, so it's about letter size. It's at 300 pixels per inch. So the way I explain this is for every inch you have 300 little squares. I'm going to hit OK. So you can zoom in. You can actually see these little pixels. Okay. All right. That's what's making up your image. I always think about like pointillism almost to make your images on your screen, those little squares. And because they're so small, it creates that picture for us to see. Okay, so students will inadvertently do the wrong resolution. So a lot of times, because we're working on projects that may be on the web, and sometimes I tell them these projects are for print. So there's this tendency to work at 72 pixels per inch would work for web graphics, but if you're actually doing it for print and you want it to look really nice when you print it out of the printer, okay, so that becomes an issue. You want like 300 would be considered high resolution. So here's the same image. I have converted it, I've flattened it into a JPEG, and I've changed the image. Let's go to image size, and you can see it is 72. Okay, so what happens? This is the same. It has the, let me go back, image size. Okay, so here's this image. It is the same size, but the resolution is at 72. Okay, so if I hit OK, and I am going to select all of it, I'm just hitting Command A, and I'm going to copy it, Command C. I'm going to go back to my document. I'm going to hit Command V. I'm going to bring this to the top here. Do you see the difference in size? And then this is what I'll get. I'll get this. They will want to transform and be like, well, I'm just going to make it larger and I'm going to fill the space. Okay. I'm going to hit check mark here. Okay, so if you look at this, obviously the quality, because what Photoshop has to do is like that information is really not there. So it basically does, I guess, kind of tries to figure out what those pixels would be at the 300. So it's really probably repeating some of the information that's already there because it's not going to be able to recreate new information that it doesn't have. And so it creates this fuzziness. So you can see that looks sharp, this looks fuzzy. So you can't just blow up a graphic and expect that I put it in a document that's 300 pixels per inch. Why isn't it working? That's why. So there are some ways to try to rework this, but it's never really very satisfactory. It's better if you work at the correct resolution the first time. So I'm just going to hit the delete, go back to my original one. And so that's one of those things you really want to catch early on in the process. So, and not at the end of your illustration project, okay? So that's probably those 5 tips. Bonus tip, though, let me mention, because it kind of ties in with the last one. Pay attention when you save your files. I have had students save a file, which it's always tough, but PSD is the native Photoshop file, so I get all these lovely layers. When you save it as a JPEG, you lose your layers. It becomes a compression file. So I've had students accidentally save over their Photoshop files with a JPEG version, and then they're like, I need to go back and make this revision. We had a critique. Oops. It's really hard because everything's flat and they've lost all their layers. So that's a bonus tip for you, or a mistake. Just try to be mindful about saving. And I tend to save up like some backups of backups. So you can try to be aware of that. Just be really mindful about how you're saving your files in the future. So I hope that helps out for those who are teaching new people who are coming to Photoshop, or those who are trying to learn Photoshop for themselves. Those are probably the most common mistakes that I see repeatedly in every semester. They just crop up, and I've gotten better at pointing them out and fixing them and helping my students out with that, or helping myself. Okay. All right. So thanks for listening.